This is part two of the rise of the new social movements. And at the end of part one, I was discussing the radical church or the progressive church in Brazil. And I have to say that there were other cases where the church went much further. There were priests involved in the Sandinista Directorate in Colombia. There were some priests involved in the guerrilla movements. And that's very complicated because, that's certainly not very Christ-like to be taking up a machine gun. But in Brazil, the politics were much more peaceful, and they were more about organizing. Now, one group that the church tried to have good ties with, but is complicated over some obvious issues, was the rising feminist movement in Brazil. Now, feminists were obviously totally new social actors in Brazil because there just had been no place for them in previous politics. The feminists in Brazil were mostly middle-class and elite women who had been many of whom had gone into exile. A lot of academics, the wives of academics, and they'd gone to Western Europe and to the United States, to many university towns, where they came in contact with what we call second wave feminism. Second wave feminism was saying it's more than just saying that women deserve rights and women deserve equal rights. There's also a kind of a deep critique of power and patriarchy, kind of looking at society in a very, very complex intellectual way. And what this is really new. There really hadn't been anything like this in Latin America. Certainly, suffrage movements, as I've said, were pretty limited. And oftentimes women did organize and women were in politics, but they were in politics, in the streets and striking and so forth, for sort of traditional things, saying, we're mothers and we're the ones who cook the food in the household and we need to protect our children and we need access to affordable and safe food, all good things. But things that many people have described as militant motherhood. In other words, things that don't challenge the structure of society. They say, look, we're the women and we're supposed to be, we're tasked with taking care of our families and our children, and you're not letting us do that. Second wave feminism is starting to say, hey, yes, of course we care about our families and our children, but shouldn't everyone care about the family? Shouldn't the men care about the family and children? Shouldn't we question the way society is organized? Now, what's interesting about that is that a lot of this was very intellectual and abstract, but now they came in contact with poor women, oftentimes their own maids. Even middle-class people in Latin America will often have maids. And so there was a lot of back and forth in the kitchen, in the household, between maids and these now politicized women. And what that did is it kind of broadened the critique of society, so that the critique of patriarchy and male-dominated society took on kind of questions of class and race and became a more interesting and complex critique, and certainly in many ways complemented the growing liberation theology. Now again, the international context is really, really important. That you had young Brazilian women who often looked to foreign examples. So I said, these women went abroad and everything. That's more middle-aged women, women in their 30s through their 50s. But teenage women and college-age women, remember we're talking about, expanded forms of communication, telecommunication, would go to the movies and they would see how women in the United States and women in Western Europe dressed and the new roles of women, and empowered by, sounds silly today, but rock and roll music, the liberating feeling of watching Janis Joplin sing. And so even though the United States was often seen as an ally of the Brazilian dictatorship, American society, as it was going through the challenges of the 60s and 70s, became a fantastic example for young women. And this is sort of an unintended consequence of the powerful, the hegemon being, a multi-ethnic, pluralistic society. That the U.S., what was going on socially and culturally in the 60s and 70s in the U.S. influenced everything from how women dressed to talked. A lot of slang from English made its way into Spanish and Portuguese. Certainly issues of sexuality and birth control that might not have been as accessible in Latin America become incredibly important as people are starting to kind of compare themselves with the United States. And so we see the rise of feminism, and we see, and, I'm jumping way ahead, but Brazil, ends up with a woman president in the 21st century, and who was a student radical during the dictatorship. And so we see, really new roles for women coming out of these experiences in the dictatorship, in an international context, and questioning what's going on. Well, one more group is really important to all the changes in Brazil, and that's the rise of so-called new labor. Now, it's new labor because it's not associated with the old corporatist populist structure. It's not part of the Communist Party. And it really bursts onto the scene. I mean, it's been kind of organizing in one form or another for many years, but in May of 1978, auto workers in foreign-owned auto factories in and around Sao Paulo begin what people label as spontaneous strikes. But they're literally hundreds of thousands of people on strike. There's nothing spontaneous about it. Now, these workers say, we're not going to bargain through the state. We don't want those populist military tools of the labor bureaucracy and corporatism. We are going to organize our own local forms of organization called factory commissions, obviously based in our factories. And we don't want anything to do with the corrupt labor bosses who are called pelegos. And we don't want anything to do with the union tax, which was a form of kind of forcing people to pay into the state union system, whether they wanted to or not. And these strikers worked directly with the foreign auto companies, and they were very, very successful in big strikes in 1978 and 79 into the early 1980s. They got significant raises from Ford and GM and Volkswagen and Saab Scania and all the Fiat, all the big multinational corporations. But the strikers also did something else, and it was they didn't set out to do this. In fact, it's kind of paradoxical that what they set out to do was to get better wages. But because of the way they did things, because they operated as such an open and democratic movement, that they started to become a symbol of a democratic ethos exactly when the Brazilian military was talking about leaving power. And they were seen as separate from, you can see on the slide, the PCB is the Communist Party, the Partido Comunista Brasileiro, and separate from the Labor Party, the Partido Trabalhista Brasileiro. They were seen as not part of that old system. They were trusted by foreign executives. The U.S. Secretary of Labor visited with them and reported back to Jimmy Carter in the late 70s. He thought they were great. They were like American Unionists. Even some military men supported them. And that was because what they sought made a lot of sense to everything. I said they embraced Fordism. Fordism is, you work hard in this kind of drudge-like job and you're going to get a high wage. And what do you do with that wage? We hope you buy a car with it, right? That workers as consumers. Now that's a very Western European and U.S. idea that was somewhat new to Latin America. They sought raises and they said, look, we want to buy a house. We want to buy a car. We don't care about taking over the government. We're not political. We want to be full participants in society by being in society, by having our own homes, by sending our kids to good schools. They were consumer-oriented and peaceful and democratic, just the way, if you go back to the reading about Juscelino Kubitschek, who helped bring the auto industry in, hoped they would be. And Kubitschek was right, that this would transform the society, and it did transform the society. It just took a very, very long time. But the bigger point, you don't need to know all the Brazilian details of the Brazilian president in the 1950s. The bigger point is that auto workers were seen as democratic in practice. They had very peaceful strikes. They had open and direct negotiations with their employers, not with the government, not with the labor ministry. And the bargaining was always based on internally, democratically derived positions that were open, everyone knew about. And what these unions said is that we also believe society itself should be more democratic. Society should be like our unions. And one of the people who comes out of this is the leader of this new movement, a guy named Lula. And there he is in 1979 in what's called the ABC region. These are suburbs of the city of Sao Paulo, Santo André, São Bernardo do Campo, São Caetano. It's another suburb called Diadema. I always wondered why it's not ABCD. But what they did is out of this, these workers formed a party, a new political party called the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the Workers' Party. And it's known as the PT, and it argued for democracy. It said internal democracy in our party, internal democracy in how we live our lives will lead to democracy in the nation. And that the means, democratic means, will always be more important than the ends. Now, this is important to keep in mind because this is still during the dictatorship. This is the early 1980s. The dictatorship ends in 1985, which we'll see in a future lecture. And the PT, the Workers' Party, was so successful because it had very close ties to the ecclesiastical-based communities and even to some in the feminist movement. And I said we're going to talk about Argentina. We'll talk about that more in the lecture on the emergence of democracy. But in Argentina, there are different groups who operate in the same way. Labor, it's not New Labor, but women start to play a big role. The church starts to play a big role as well. So sticking with Brazil and thinking about these new social movements, we see that the church or new actors in the church and feminists and New Labor provided a political vocabulary and political spaces for something called the abertura. The abertura is when the military decided in the late 1970s they wanted to open society a little bit more. Now, I emphasize the word open. Abertura means the opening. And there's a cognate in English, aperture, right? You think of an old-fashioned camera opening, it's aperture. And so just with the military saying, we're thinking of leaving power and we're not really sure what's going to follow, we've got these new social movements saying, look, how about some democracy? This is what we're into, and challenging the status quo. And we have the first real experiences with a kind of political liberalism to complement the economic liberalism. And so we see the church and workers are seen as reformist, as very democratic, as kind of US and Western European-like. And people start to say, well, look at that. Maybe we are ready for democracy. And everything points to the establishment of democracy. The military itself in Brazil and elsewhere, the militaries are starting to become exhausted institutionally. The United States, at least through 1980, is pushing for democracy under President Jimmy Carter. Many in the business community in Brazil who had supported the military are now kind of tired of the military. And nearly everyone is hoping for a stable democracy. And from 1985 when the military left, and we'll talk about this in an upcoming lecture, through the mid-1990s, democracy was worked out. But what's so interesting is that it was worked out largely on terms set by these new social movements.